And the question is beer the Anglican thing?
What is the Anglican
I think it.
libation?
What is it? Gin. I think I heard it over here. Gin is the official. Yes.
Among the
I would say
priests,
gin is
most
the
definitely.
Anglo-Catholic libation.
Yes.
Gin on ice with
There must
twist.
be a reason for the term whiskey failure.
No, fair point.
I think in this group it might just be a millennial thing, but because we just got off a clergy retreat, and for most of us beer lovers, the selections that the people in charge give us are Miller Lite, Coors Light, and Bud Light, and that does not pass. That does not pass millennial craft beer snobbery.
It didn't stop me.
Well, I'm not a millennial, and I didn't mind.
It didn't stop me.
I struggled through one free Miller Lite, and from there on
You
out.
know, as a senior priest said, what's better than beer? A free beer. The Coors Light was free.
I will inform the laity. I can't remember what the date is, but you can see it on most priests' Facebook pages, and maybe one of you guys know the dates. There is actually an official Buy Your Beer a Priest Day.
Buy your beer a priest?
You got it?
I think you mean buy your priest a beer.
I know.
Oh.
I've had 3 sips, guys. It's okay. That was on purpose.
Deep theological questions. I have one. Why is it pronounced compline? Compline.
Compline.
Not compline.
I don't know.
I defer to Father Matkin.
Straight out of Coupland.
I would imagine it has something to do with the Latin pronunciation, possibly.
I guess so. It's just that unnecessary E at the end.
That shows that it's very Anglican, that we put unnecessary E's on things.
Like the old shoe shop. Shoppy.
Yeah, shop E. Yes.
The old compliment.
Maybe that's it.
Well, I disagree that the Anglican thing is gin, though. My mother's Roman. She drinks about 3 double gins a day.
Oh my Lord.
She's 93.
The secret
on her. Wow.
She's just drinking herself to death.
I know.
It's going to happen eventually.
There was a story from Dallas just a few months ago, maybe a year ago now, of some guy turned 110 who lived in Dallas or Fort Worth, and they asked him what his secret was, and he said it was 3 whiskeys and 2 cigars a day. And he would have a whiskey at breakfast, lunch, and dinner, and he would have a cigar after lunch and a cigar after dinner. And that was,
bless him.
so then there was the lady at the Texas game who said, she's 80, 90-something years old, and she said she had 2 Dr. Peppers a day. So, or was it 3? I don't know, 2 or 3. So.
At 10 to 4.
Yeah, yes.
Yes.
Drink a bite to eat. All right. Well, let's get started with our topic for tonight. Last year we talked about ghosts. This year, I came up with this because it's been something that I encountered and it's been just on my mind. And so that's how we get our topics, is this I'm thinking about it. The question for tonight is, do we have a problem with delusion? And what is to be done about it? And this came to my mind because I saw an interview with Heather MacDonald, who has a new book out called The Diversity Delusion. So I wanted to read a book review from a magazine, National Review, to kind of get us familiar with that, and then I'll bring up some things to kind of expand our thoughts and reflections, and we'll hear from our distinguished panel of guests. So the review goes like this. Heather MacDonald is quite familiar with the insanity of the modern university. Last year, having been invited to speak about Black Lives Matter and her book, The War on Cops, at Claremont McKenna College, she showed up to face intense opposition. Opposition directed not just at her views, but at her very right to speak. Students called for the talk to be shut down and repeatedly smeared MacDonald as a fascist. Fearing violence, the administration changed the venue to one with fewer glass windows and more escape routes, and shuttled her to what she described as a de facto safe house with the blinds drawn. She eventually gave her speech indirectly via video stream. The Q&A session was cut short after 2 questions. MacDonald tells this story in her new book, The Diversity Delusion, before proceeding to offer a wide-ranging challenge to campus orthodoxies on race and gender. She covers everything from college administrators' anti-racism policies to trivial on-campus racial incidents that inevitably blow up into major scandals, to allegations of a rape epidemic, to the push to bring more women into science. The book is mostly an amalgamation of previously published writing, some of it from National Review, which is doing this book review. But the material is rearranged and updated in a way that makes it feel fresh, even to those who followed her work religiously. When it comes to race on campus, the Diversity Delusion touches on many of the major themes MacDonald's writings has explored in the past. She tells the story of California University's steadfast resistance to the state's affirmative action ban, for example, and discusses research suggesting that in some cases affirmative action can harm the very people it's intended to help by bringing them into schools where their academic skills are not competitive. She also notes administrators' performative self-flagellation in the face of protests, a ritual in which they claim their own institutions are racist to the bone, something they, of course, would not do if they thought anyone, especially the donors, took it seriously. In a recurring and amusing gag, she asks college administrators and corporate managers to justify their extensive anti-bias efforts with evidence that their institutions discriminate against minorities in the first place. Speaking of bias training, MacDonald spends a chapter detailing the woes of the implicit association test, the IAT. This is a computer program in which subjects are asked to push one button if a black face appears on the screen, and another button if a white face appears. The trick being that each button is also assigned to either positive or negative words, such as pleasant and death, which sometimes appear in place of the faces. In general, whites perform faster and more efficiently when white faces and positive words are assigned to the same button, while black performance tends not to differ much either way. The test and the aggressive claims made about its power to uncover hidden prejudice has come under withering scrutiny in recent years, especially in a long New York Magazine piece by the science journalist Jesse Singal. As MacDonald recounts, it's unclear what the test is even measuring. It doesn't do a good job of predicting discriminatory behavior, often measured through somewhat silly experiments, such as asking the subject to choose between helping poor Colombian children or poor South African children. It might measure simple familiarity with one racial group over another, or it might measure the extent to which race is associated with positive or negative concepts in the social environment, rather than the test taker's own bias. It also provides inconsistent results when taken multiple times by the same person. All this makes it a rather poor decision-making tool, which of course hasn't stopped its use in employment screening and even discrimination lawsuits. On gender, the Diversity Delusion features a new version of MacDonald's classic 2008 City Journal essay, The Campus Rape Myth, in which she explores the claim that 1 in 5, or 1 in 4, college women are raped, and traces it to poorly conducted surveys that classify incidents as rape, even when they clearly don't meet the legal definition of the term. What generally is a widespread epidemic on campus, MacDonald argues, is drunken sex that leads to regret and to shame. Anyone want some more? MacDonald also deflates the hysteria over the dearth of women in science, noting the flap over former Google engineer James Damore, whose memo to his then employer detail various reasons, aside from discrimination, that women may be underrepresented in the tech industry. In much the same vein, MacDonald notes that females tend to have lower interest in the scientific fields, that, quote, differences in math, precocity, I don't know that word, between boys and girls show up as early as kindergarten, and that women with high math ability are more likely than their male peers to have high verbal skills as well, giving them more career options. In other words, men and women have different skill sets. If I was not a priest, that statement would get me fired. For anyone steeped in liberal dogma, the diversity delusion will provide the other side of the story. It will also be invaluable for conservative college students who want to know what their professors aren't telling them. But what struck me most, more than 10 years out from my own graduation, was how simply misdirected the academic left's energies are, forcing conservatives to spend their time batting down ridiculous but ubiquitous assertions rather than addressing the underlying issues. Claims about campus sexual assault are hugely overblown, for example, but sexual assault is a serious problem. It's almost certainly underreported, and it appears, per an extensive Justice Department report, to be a more common experience among women who do not go to college. So why have we all been talking about an easily debunked campus rape crisis since the 1980s? On race, MacDonald is of course correct that university administrations and major corporations go out of their way to welcome underrepresented minority applicants, to the point of severely biasing the admissions and hiring processes against whites and Asians. But the same is not true of other actors in society. Various experimental studies, including ones that send matched pairs of black and white testers to apply for jobs, show that blacks still face marked discrimination in the job market, particularly the low-wage job market. In one matched pair study conducted in New York City that varied applicants' criminal records in addition to their races, quote, black and Latino applicants with clean backgrounds fared no better than white applicants just released from prison. Would that college activist spent more time talking about this and less time manufacturing the flag catchers on their own liberal campuses? And while IAT, that test, is not the magic racism detector it's long been billed as, we should hardly be proud of the fact that white Americans find it psychologically difficult to pair black faces with positive concepts, a result that is incredibly well established, even if it's been overinterpreted. I took the test myself as a college freshman and was shocked to discover that despite the fact that I saw myself as colorblind, literally, but more to the point, figuratively as well, my brain clearly did not process racial information in a colorblind manner. This is a valuable experience for whites to have, and certainly the AIT result say something about the current state of race relations, even if it isn't remotely fit for use as a hiring tool. By treating it as one, the left directed everyone's attention to the test's weaknesses rather than to its strengths. Academic leftists should focus on fighting these real problems rather than on what MacDonald calls the phantom racism they believe is ever present on campus. And as National Review's Rian Salam forcefully argued in a recent blog post, the right should join them in recognizing the ongoing struggles of African Americans and the need to relieve poverty and build opportunities for economic mobility, the kinds of things that really matter to people outside the college bubble. This brings me to a small criticism of the diversity delusion. In her chapter on implicit bias, MacDonald notes the startlingly high rate of violence among blacks and whites that, quote, until those realities of crime change, any alleged stereotypical associations between blacks and crime in the public mind will remain justified and psychologically unavoidable. She also represents a thought experiment, and this is a block quote. If American blacks acted en masse like Asian Americans for 10 years in all things relevant to economic success, if they had similar rates of school attendance, paying attention in class, doing homework, studying for exams, staying away from crime, persisting in a job, and avoiding out-of-wedlock childbearing, and we still saw racial differences in income, professional status, and incarceration rates, then it would be well justified to seek an explanation in unconscious prejudice. But as long as the behavioral disparities remain so great, the minute distinctions of the IAT are a sideshow. He continues, MacDonald is correct that when groups behave in different ways, they are bound to be seen differently and to achieve different levels of success. This is an enormously blind spot for many on the left. Indeed, many liberals find group differences in behavior unthinkable to begin with. But such an observation is incomplete without its counterpart, too often a blind spot for the right. If we expect black Americans to overcome what MacDonald describes as the United States' appalling history of racism and brutal subjugation, certainly we must also insist that whites overcome their negative racial attitudes and treat blacks and whites equally, even when statistical gaps may make it rational to do otherwise, so that blacks experience fair treatment during this process and are rewarded for their efforts in the job market. While cultural and behavioral issues may well play a bigger role in ongoing racial disparities than do modern-day discrimination and prejudice, the latter are a non-negotiable problem that warrants our attention as well. That said, the Diversity Delusion does an admirable job of dismantling liberal academic narratives, and if anyone has earned the right to do that without looking back, it's Heather MacDonald. So that's the review. It wasn't the best review, but it went into a lot of things. I would commend, if you're interested in hearing more from her, and maybe you're not sure if you want to buy the book. I haven't gotten the book myself yet. But she's done a lot of interviews on her book tour, and probably the best one is the long-form interview with Dave Rubin, where she discusses a lot of the material that she covers in the book. And the disparity between, and this is really what I'm getting at, what I'm interested in, is the disparity between the outrage and the reality. So you have tremendous outrage about something that's perceived as a horrible problem and difficulty and challenge, and then the reality just isn't there. So it's like myth. So do we have a problem with delusion? And what is to be done? Let me throw you some other parallel examples. The vagina monologues. One of your favorite, I'm sure. Once controversial because it's so raunchy. It's still controversial, but not for the same reason. Today, it's controversial because it's transphobic, because not all women have vaginas. So how dare you put up a play called The Vagina Monologues that excludes all these women who can't relate. Conspiracy theories. Conspiracy theories abound and have only been fueled even more since the dawn of the internet. There's been many times, especially since the Kevin Costner movie came out in the 80s or 90s, where I feel like I'm the only one in the world that thinks that President Kennedy was killed by Lee Harvey Oswald. Consider all the following of the 9/11 truth movement. And you'll notice if somebody really adheres to one conspiracy theory, they pretty much do to almost everything you can find. That tends to be more the pattern than not. Consider also what delusion, you might say, these things open up. Consider all the extraordinary things that would need to be true if indeed that was an inside job, as argued. Consider more people today believe the earth is flat than in any time in human history, even in this age of scientific enlightenment. I'm not going to get into politics and Trump and all that kind of stuff, but for me, one moment really encapsulates the whole thing. The day after inauguration, first press conference, Sean Spicer comes out with a picture of the crowd. And since day one, it's been a fight about the nature of reality. Was this a big crowd? Was this a small crowd? And who cares? And what role does narrative, pushing a narrative, play in delusion? How do you know if something is real? I'm going to turn it over to our panel. Do we have a problem of delusion? And what in the world are we supposed to do about it?
Yes, and I don't know.
Good night, everybody.
Father Stubblefield, your response.
Great. I don't know where I want to go with this. I'm more worried about where they're going to go with this. One of my initial thoughts about this is the review seems to be very one-sided conservatively. Whenever it seems like both sides are errant in the same places, where we have both conservatives and liberals who, once they hold to what they believe, they're not willing to let it go, regardless of what's put in front of them, which is kind of what we're talking about here. And in that sense, where my initial thought goes with this, it would almost beg even more so that this delusion of our own personal thoughts is definitely the case. Because I'm kind of intrigued with this book, because I think I agree with some parts. Other parts of it seem to make no sense at all. And I might have heard you wrong. That's also true. So it seemed in that case that delusion is definitely a problem, because once we get into our mindset, we don't change it very easily. What to do about it? I think Father Drummond has an idea.
Didn't you just say I don't know?
He's thought about it since then.
I know now.
You now know. Yes.
I just needed a few minutes to think about it. Yeah. Now, I actually don't know what to do about it, but I do have some thoughts on the delusion aspect of it. And I think it is delusion, and I mean, I think as priests we do, as we should, try and look at everything theologically, not just religious concerns, but and so when I look at the kinds of things that we're talking about here, the outrage and I was reading something the other day about the cancel culture. If you're familiar with that term, where if you're a high-profile celebrity, you're an actor or a journalist or something like that.
And we can all tick them off one by one.
That's right.
You're thinking about it.
Right. And you say one thing that sparks this outrage, you're gone. You disappear for a while. And if you're lucky, in a few years you can come back after you've been on the cover of People magazine or Ellen DeGeneres show talking about how sorry you are. Rather than just saying, I probably misspoke and I apologize for that and move on. But when I look at the culture of outrage, I think the delusion is not so much what you see, it's failure to see what's actually there, what's actually going on. This made a lot more sense in my head. I'm having trouble articulating it.
Those are some good thoughts. Shall we go to Father Vowles? One thing I was
Shutting me up already?
Well, I thought you needed a rescue
That's
there.
the music.
No, I didn't need a rescue.
Okay. Well, please continue then.
No, we'll come back to
Well,
it.
Father Vowles, I was having a thought as Father Drummond was talking about. Do you think that social media, smartphones, the multiplication of news sources, all this kind of fracturing of our sources of experience has played into the widespread?
That's exactly
delusion?
actually where I was going to go. So worked off well. When
Great minds think alike.
Yeah, it's I mean, I'm not going to even pretend that I don't generally follow the more conservative line of stuff. So as I say this, being honest of where your philosophical grounding comes from and being able to have a discussion. When I was in high school, we had all kinds of different people there. This was the 90s. And we would sit around in our group of tables and friends, and we could talk about what our parents believed, this is kind of where I'm at right now. At that point, at least, you went to college, and there was actually what we called free speech zones, where anyone could get up there and say whatever the heck they wanted to. I think what we've gotten, I think part of the problem of the delusion is we've erased the right to disagree. And so instead of saying, wow, I completely disagree with everything you're saying, but that's interesting. Let me think about that. And actually being challenged. I think some of it comes, I had a conversation the other day, and I'm going to try not to get into the politics, but you can't. We're in the middle of the season, right? So I'm not going to be picking sides or anything. It was just, there was something that was said about somebody. Everyone probably knows who it is, right? So something was said about somebody, and I very quickly, because, I follow some of this stuff, picked up on the fact that, they were really just parroting what one news source said. And, and I've met a ton of, by the way, it was CNN, but I've met a lot of conservatives who just parrot whatever Fox News said. And I think what we need to do, no matter where we stand and how we're having discussions, theologically, is to go back to the truth shall set you free. I think the problem is we're a lazy culture. We want our soundbite. We want to hear what the $5 million talking head says on Fox News or CNN. And instead of actually reading and watching what people say. So the context was there, blah, 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 said blah, blah, blah. And I said, did you actually watch the whole thing? Well, no, I saw it on blah, blah, blah. They showed a thing and they talked about it. Well, of course, they're giving their opinion on it. We have to go back to actually watching it. So, for instance, this Tuesday is going to be a State of the Union, right? It used to be the country shut down and everyone watched it. It didn't matter who the guy was, right? You would watch it. What's going to happen is the ratings are terrible, and he's going to say a bunch of stuff, and the talking heads are going to go blah, 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 and you're going to see a million tiny little blips on Facebook, on Twitter, on Fox News, on CNN, on MSNBC, and Freudian. Sorry. And sorry, it was a joke. So yes, but anyway. But the point is I don't care if your presuppositions generally are to the conservative or to the liberal, to capitalist versus communist, whatever. Read the full thing and know your arguments. Don't just parrot what someone else tells you. And I think we have to do that in our theology too. So I think what we have is that's really not about politics or theology. It's about how we really have been trained out of how not to think for ourselves and to actually debate. I mean, the academy is supposed to be to sharpen ideas and to share tools and to have challenging ideas. If we really think about this, if we create such a politically correct world where you can't offend anybody, I mean, really think about the world you're going to have.
That's what we got.
And I mean, it's getting very bad. An example of this, just yesterday, a few weeks ago, the College of Bishops of the Church of England issued a statement saying sex is for heterosexuals in marriage. That's the teaching of the English Church. And the whole thing blew up, and the Archbishop of Canterbury in New York came out a couple days later, like yesterday, was like, we're really sorry that we hurt people's feelings. It's like this, it's this, because what happened is they got nailed by the delusion crowd, and the shaming and the name calling and the violence and the threats of violence actually are forcing people to have to retract and say things instead of actually having a conversation what is sex for, what are relationships, we just get on our side, and it's like, I think honestly, eventually we're going to have violence at campuses. I mean, it's inevitable, I think. So we got to stop it.
Father Drummond.
I've collected my thoughts.
My rant's over.
Completely irrelevant to society. Campuses are, most people in the United States cannot afford to go to college. Those who do come out of college do not get the careers that they were sold a bill of goods to go and get.
And they're in debt out of their ears.
And they're dead out of their ears.
Yeah.
The people who are running this charade of what's acceptable, the truth, what you can and can't agree with, are holed up in the colleges. The people, the dirt people versus the cloud people, who actually can go and make a living and start families and do what they're supposed to do, are no longer wasting time in college. They're going to the trade schools, and they're coming out making, after 2 years max, coming out making $80,000 a year, and they've been spared all of this Marxist rubbish. They're shown, this is what happens when you have this amount of pressure in this line, this is what happens when you have that amount of pressure in that line. There's no debate in between those two things, and knowing how to do those things allows a young man or a young woman to make a living, and as that reality continues, the relevance of the campus is going to be only for discussions like this. And they'll get old and broke.
Let me add this point. A young person looking for the truth can't find it, because the internet that was supposed to make us all equally intelligent is full of rubbish and lies. And we, as the senior members of society, allow the people running our country and our companies to make decisions based on feelings and not based on fact. 10 years ago, if I had heard you quote National Review, I would have assigned a high credibility rating to it. Today, National Review is no better than the New York Times or the Washington Post, because they're all trying to sell a point, which is to sell the next book that they're going to have. You can't find the truth unless you're strong enough to stand up and say, I don't give a damn if I hurt your feelings. This is reality.
Your mention of feelings, I want to introduce a new element, and I'll come back to Father Drummond. I wanted to introduce the philosophical idea of the logical fallacy of solipsism. That may or may not be a familiar term, but it's extremely important, and you ought to put it in your lexicon.
PhD in solipsism.
So this is the error, philosophical error, that what I think and feel is more important than the physical world around me. In fact, what I feel is the measure of reality. So this is most dramatically illustrated, for example, when people affirm that the real me is a different sex than my body, or even more dramatically, that the real me does not include one or more of my limbs, and so must be amputated. And instead of help and counseling and, an effort to deliver from the delusion, many, of course, in the healing professions have entertained such delusions with affirmation. Consider the example of Nicholas Matt. As some of you might have seen this, as a part of a panel with Jordan Peterson on the agenda on Canadian television, Matt famously asserted, quote, "It's not correct that there is such a thing as biological sex." And he's a historian with a PhD who is a professor at the University of Toronto, specializes in transgender studies. He calls himself a historian of medicine, and asserts that this is a very popular misconception, that there is such a thing as biological sex. Do we have a problem with delusion? Father Drummond. You'd have to answer that.
Yes, we have a problem with delusion.
No, I don't know how to fix
No,
it.
I don't know.
We circle back
Well,
around.
related to that, the delusion, okay, G.K. Chesterton, who was a famous English writer, once responded with a letter to the editor of the London Times or something like that, to an editorial that asked the question, what is wrong with the world today? And G.K. Chesterton wrote to the paper, I am. G.K. Chesterton. And what he meant by that, I thought was really, really profound. Not that we are the center of the world and there's something, wrong with us, but when it comes to theologically informing how we think through things that are going on in the world, the truth implicit in the outrage culture is that there is something wrong. There's something wrong that needs to be addressed. There's something wrong that needs to be struggled against and battled. The delusion comes in nobody wanting to realize the real root cause of those things. So Chesterton gave a very Christian answer. What is wrong with the world today? I am. Why? Because I'm a fallen human being and a sinner. And I'm not a sinner because I sin. I sin because I am a sinner. It's an internal orientation, since that's a popular word, right? We're just kind of orientated towards sin, and that's why we need grace in salvation. We don't need a moral program that will teach us and re-educate us, to use another hot-button Marxist term. We need radical transformation from the inside out. I'm going to be unfair here because it works on both sides of the aisle, but for the most part, the left does not want to entertain the idea that there is anything implicitly wrong with all of us. They know that something is wrong because it's part of our human impulse to, have that sense something's out of whack, something's wrong, and to fight against it and struggle against it. Their answer to the editorial, what's wrong with the world today, whereas Chesterton very Christianly said, I am, the outrage culture today would write back and say, you are.
Yeah.
So the problem is always somebody else. It's always somebody on the outside. It couldn't possibly be me. When you read the books of the prophets, when they're interceding for their people who are engaged in gross sin, the prophets who themselves are not engaged in those things are constantly saying, "Oh Lord, we have turned our backs against you." The outrage culture says, "Oh Lord, all these people have," does that kind of make sense? What I'm getting at? So, but that is the unredeemed heart speaking. And I think that's where the delusion comes in. Failing to see. So we know that there's a problem and we ought to be addressing something and attacking something. And since we don't want to deal with what's actually wrong, which would then spread out to address all of these other issues, we either make things up or we amplify things or we get the heat off of ourselves. To your laziness point, and then I'll shut up. We are a soft and flabby, lazy culture. And I don't mean physically. I mean intellectually, morally, mentally. It's very easy to get caught up in all of this outrage culture type business if you don't actually have to struggle against anything in your life. If you actually have no battles to fight, then you have to make them up. in order to feel like you're doing something.
Right.
And so you almost can't imagine what they often call the greatest generation having these kinds of debates and discussions. They were too busy fighting wars. They were too busy trying to live off of the little bit that got rationed to them. They were too busy working in factories. They were too busy. And they were strong and they were tough. And we're just kind of not.
There's a good example of that. Just a friend of mine just showed a picture. He took his son out hunting, and they got a turkey and posted it on Facebook. Which just don't post on Facebook. But it doesn't matter. Just to demonstrate the flabby softiness, right? Of one of the posts was, "That's disgusting," and then the response was like, "Are you a vegan?" Well, no. What do you eat on Thanksgiving? Well, we eat turkey. It's like, how do you think this happens? Right? It kind of goes to the outrage of, blah, 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 stop doing this, be nice to animals. It's like, you eat meat. And there's actually people in the store who think they get their meat from the store. Okay? And they don't recognize that. And going back to the greatest generation, most of those people grew up in a place they would buy the chicken and have to do the chicken. You know what I'm saying? Most Americans have never had to do anything besides take something out of the packet, put salt and pepper on it, or literally take the cellophane off and put it in the microwave. And we don't even have a real grasp of where our food comes from. And so the delusion nature goes into every lazy, flabby way in which we do life. So much so that a friend of mine who hunts and stuff like that is actually ridiculed for actually sourcing his food from nature instead of getting it with all the stuff and the stuff they shoot it in and all that kind of stuff. And it's an amazing disconnect from everything, our forefathers and I don't care if you're a vegan, it's fine. But, it's just a little example of that. Oh, you killed the turkey. It's like you just ate turkey for Thanksgiving last year,
Last night in the clergy frat house, we were having a laugh at some of the headlines.
Beer down there, please?
Call me by my proper title, and I might.
Oh, sorry, Father Stubble. Could you
Stubblefield,
could you hook me up with another
Me too.
all-day IPA, please?
Me too.
And one for Father Jeffrey.
very beardless.
Thank you, sir.
I'll get my own beard.
We were laughing about some headlines in a rather fine Christian satire publication
I was in the middle, that's why.
Called the Babylon Bee. And one of the headlines, and of course, this very thing they take on, head on. This whole culture of outrage and virtue signaling and all of that. One of the headlines was, Yale Medical School quits teaching medicine discovered by white males. Of course, it's a satire, fake headline. But is that all that ridiculous to imagine? I mean, in the direction that...
The best satire is where you're like, maybe that could happen. Yeah.
So that's, the delusion just grows to where, rationality is completely gone.
So we're coming down to our closing minutes, and you took us in a spiritual direction. I want to push further in that direction. I want to wrap up with you, Father Stubbs. Let me introduce one more factor here. We started out with a discussion with Heather MacDonald in her book, The Diversity Delusion, and she talks a lot about the just disconnect between reality and what people are complaining about on college campuses and so on. Heather MacDonald is an atheist.
I would have thought she was a right-wing Christian.
That's what you might have thought.
So deluded.
So she writes about delusion. She doesn't believe there's God. It's not that she's agnostic or something. She's not like an evangelical atheist, like you see Richard Dawkins or something, but she doesn't believe in God. So even though she doesn't really talk about that, she logically, I think, would conclude that people who do are deluded. So are we deluded? Or is she deluded? And how do we know?
You are all deluded.
I would say it. So this last week I was in a class, and it was looking at the way in which we read Scripture, and we can actually, I think, expand that to this section. He says you cannot read Scripture without a metaphysic. He says it's impossible to do without. So the way we're setting it up, it was Christian realism, Christian Platonism versus nominalism, which is
You have to explain all
so. So nominalism is I decide that this is not a beer, this is water.
Nominal.
It's because I said that this is water, this is water.
You're labeling things.
Labeling things
Making names.
So, and that's the mentality of the world right now. Is a rationalist. I have to have the empirical evidence for something, but only the empirical evidence that I accept, because I am the one who decides whether or not this is true. And in this class, we were talking about the fact that when everyone is equal, the only way for order to happen is that someone has to push down someone else. I have to shout you down, essentially, to say, no, this is water, not beer. It is made with water, it has some other things in it, and essentially it is water. All the other things, those don't matter. This is only water. And so don't you agree with me that this is water because of what I just said? And so it comes up as opposed to a realist understanding that there's essentially this hierarchy of being, and that the lower elements are caught up into the upper elements, and they participate in a greater reality. This beer, it participates in the reality of beerness because it has alcohol and all these things, so that there is now a reality that this participates in. So it kind of separates the situations that we're talking about here, saying that. Is there such a thing as gender? Yes. Just because you call yourself whatever, that doesn't change the reality in which you participate. That means that you have decided to reject that, and you're just deluded. So there's a reality versus what we want to be the reality, and one is Christian, the other one is whatever I want it to be. I want it to be Christian sometimes, I want it to not be Christian sometimes. I want it to be whatever is most advantageous for me at the moment. So I can go all over the place because there's nothing nailing this to reality. And I think that is the way to delude ourselves. Is that the word I'm looking for? Yes. Because I said it's the word I'm looking for.
Big nominalist?
Yes. But is to realize that we're all participating in the greater glory of God, in the nature that He's given us, and we can understand that we are the problem. Going back to Chesterton, what's this? I'm the problem here. And that's rather than saying, no, I'm not the problem. This is the problem, that's the problem. This is what's causing me to sin because I have put everything onto it. Rather than saying, I'm participating in God, but I'm doing it poorly. So now it's more on me than anything else. And I think that's the problem, is a failure to realize that what we're taught in kindergarten. You point here, you got 3 pointing back at you. It's that understanding that we are what's wrong in the world, but the good news is that's something we can work on. And all of this frustration, all the delusion, all of that is caught up in the fact that we cannot change it. All it does is frustrate us. This is the problem. No, that's the problem. But if we're working in this hierarchy of being, where the lower is caught up into the upper and participates in that, then we can say, okay, I'm falling short of what I'm falling short of what I need to be doing, and it's more on me than on anybody else.
One of the questions.
Father Stubblefield, let me before I'll give you the last word, but I wanted to pull in two philosophical reflections on things that I heard earlier from Father Drummond and then from Father Stubbs here just now. We were talking in our moral theology class about the preternatural gifts before the fall, and one of them was integrity. That is, that your reason and your passions are in sync and they're not at war with each other. And we find that you have, or we are craving an integrity between ourselves and the world around us, the reality around us. And another thing about reality, one of my predecessors, Father Homer Rogers, the barnyard Thomist, is very much into Aristotle and Thomas Aquinas, and taught at Nashotah House. And I love the way that he expressed it is that pattern and matter, the root words there are pater and mater, mother and father. And when pater and mater, mother and father, come together, they give birth to reality. But the delusion is keeping those separate from each other and lacking that integrity and integration in life. And when we go into a more search of spiritual wholeness, then we're less likely to segregate things, and when we segregate things, we pit things against each other. We'll come to Father Stubblefield for the closing thoughts.
Kind of overarching, we can talk about the different minor details we've talked about throughout the night, but kind of one overarching thing I've been thinking about is Christianity versus atheism, and it's come up a couple of times. And Father Matkin kind of proposed this question a little bit ago: are we delusional or are they delusional, right? And our natural reaction is, well, they're delusional, we're right, naturally. And you kind of have to then ask the question, well, does that go into the delusional problem we've been talking about? And kind of my initial thought, and bear with me as I shortly explain this, because he'll cut me off if I don't shortly explain it, is I would say we're both delusional on the aisle of Christianity and atheism. And bear with me for a second, as he mentioned the author, or the evangelical atheist, as he coined him, Richard Dawkins. You might be familiar with one of his most famous books, The God Delusion, right? In short, the argument of his book is that those who believe in religion, those who believe in a God, are the delusional ones. If you are subject to delusion, it puts you in what he calls religion. If we look at the definition of delusion, it is consistently believing a reality that goes directly against evidence, what we're told. And based off of that short little Merriam-Webster definition, my response to Richard Dawkins is, yeah, we're delusional, sure. Because we believe something that, as we've talked about, consistently goes against nature time and time again. Evidence tells us things are this way, yet we believe something that goes against that, right? Can some being be present in bread and wine? No, that doesn't really make sense. Like, evidence would say no, right? Can this happen? Can we take a loaf of bread and feed 5,000 people with it? Evidence, matter, tells us no. You know, you could run that experiment a million times. Never would you be able to do it, right? By the strict definition, that's delusional. The error we've fallen into tonight, I would say, is that delusion is always wrong. That because you're delusional, you're wrong or mentally insane, however you want to put it. Because we believe those things, because at the same time, no, they don't have evidence within nature. We do have all the evidence we need in nature, right? Which is why they're delusional in the sense that Well, no, it goes against nature. Evidence generally tells us we can't make, we can't feed 5,000 with bread. Yet, we have the evidence in Jesus Christ that he does, right? He can. So therefore, you can. Evidence points they're delusional. The real presence in the sacrament. Time and time again, we make the Eucharist and the sacrifice of the Mass, and Jesus, the Holy Ghost, comes down on the elements. We have Jesus, right? There's our evidence, time and time again. Evidence tells us that can't happen, but evidence, times and times, tells us it can. Sure, we're delusional, so are they, but it doesn't mean we're wrong. We have the evidence, and we have the faith and the hope and the love, as we'll talk about, that kind of creates that even though sometimes our belief goes against nature and what evidence tells us in society, that we're not wrong. We're on the right path.
Thank you. It's very intriguing that your closing comments, I think the Holy Spirit's been a part of our discussion, as he has been before. But it segues right into my closing verse of Scripture that I picked out, which you might say is kind of like a confrontation about delusion. So it's John 18:37. So Pilate said to him, to Jesus, "So, you are a king?" Jesus answered, "You say that I'm a king. For this I was born, and for this I have come into the world, to bear witness to the truth. Everyone who is of the truth hears my voice." Thank you, gentlemen, for your thoughts and contributions tonight. Thank you, everyone else, for your participation.